The gun that nobody owns, but everyone shills. Vipertech. Vipertech isn't a well-known brand, but has picked up a reputation for making high-end airsoft guns for collectors that aren't great for actual play. After getting a lot of hands-on time with them, though, I don't think that's a fair assessment. Vipertech originally made gas blowback M4s on behalf of Inokatsu up until around 2010 or so. These are based on the Western Arms design, which, if you're not familiar, was the predecessor to most of the gas blowback ARs currently on the market. After the companies parted ways, Vipertech started to iterate on the Western Arms design, retaining most of the same basic design and materials, but incrementally tweaking with each model year. To start, let's walk through the externals on this Vipertech replica of a Colt Model 733. The Model 733 is Colt's designation for a compact carbine with 11.5-inch barrel manufactured as part of the M16A2 family, which Colt marketed as the M16A2 Commando. Because this was a commercial product rather than a military standard, there's some variety in the features found on this carbine over the years it was produced. The gun Vipertech produces is a replica of the early production 733 for the most part, but I've set this up as a replica of the later production example featured in the 1995 film Heat. So at the very front is a steel flash hider based on the common birdcage style. Vipertech originally supplied it with a modern crush washer, but a peel washer is more appropriate for this era of gun, so I swapped it out for some shims intended for a real AR. Underneath the flash hider is an adapter for standard 1/2 by 28 threads, so it can accept real muzzle devices. The 11.5-inch barrel is also steel, and so is the front sight block. These parts have a nice parkerized finish that's a great match for the real thing and is stood up well to wear. Originally, the gun had a bayonet lug, which is non-functional due to the short barrel length, but later production 733s lacked this, so I ground it off. Additionally, the gun did not come with a sling swivel, so I added one. These handguards are modern production carbine handguards from DSA. The handguards made by Vipertech have a much shinier finish, which is accurate to early real handguards, but don't have the metal heat shields internally that a real one would. Underneath the handguard, there's a steel mock gas tube which runs through the steel barrel nut and aluminum delta ring. This barrel nut is the same size as a real one, so an armorer's wrench works fine. And on the underside of the barrel, there's a small window cut to access the hop-up adjustment. Vipertech receivers are 6061 aluminum and apparently forged on original Colt dies. For those not familiar with real AR composition, receivers are typically made from either 6061 or 7075 aluminum and can be made from casts, billet, or forgings in increasing order of durability. 7075 is stronger, although less corrosion resistant, and is the standard for mil-spec, but 6061 is generally regarded as more than sufficient for real ARs. For either alloy, forgings produce the highest strength, but the receivers are rarely under enough stress for it to matter. So, to be clear, this is not modern mil-spec, but it is comparable to a middle-of-the-road civilian AR. However, this upper receiver is not from Vipertech. It's actually a real A1E1 or C7 upper, which I've modified to fit. More on that later. On the lower, the engravings are deep and well done. Unfortunately, there's a mild typo here, with the apostrophe in Colts being misplaced on this receiver. Other than that, it's accurate to an actual Colt 733 with A2 carbine markings. For comparison, here's a Vipertech M16A4 receiver showing FN markings. These were all correct to the real thing and look pretty nice. The finish on Vipertech receivers is Type 3 hardcoat anodizing. This is tough stuff, and I've seen no real wear from use. Any little chips you see are due to me being a caveman armed with hand tools. In the areas where I have deliberately removed material, it's taken a significant effort with hand files to remove the finish. Controls are all steel bolt catch, trigger, and selector switch. I'm using a real charging handle, but the charging handle that comes with the gun is aluminum and virtually identical to a mil-spec one. The real charging handle is a drop-in fit. The pistol grip is a good replica of a standard A2 grip, so I didn't feel any need to replace it. Unsurprisingly, the gun accepts real grips with no modification. One minor deviation from the real thing is that the Vipertech has a grub screw to retain the selector detent spring, so that's one less thing to lose when swapping grips. The buffer tube is a 5-position mil-spec aluminum tube with a steel end plate, which retains the rear takedown pin detent spring as on the real thing. It's secured with a standard real spec castle nut. And lastly, this is a real carbine buttstock, but the original is virtually identical. Overall, it's not an exaggeration to say that this feels exactly like a real AR. Everything's made of the same materials as the real deal, so the balance is right, and the parkerizing and anodization are simply perfect. There's none of that sense of close but not quite that I often get with airsoft replicas of firearms I'm familiar with. Some airsoft replicas will boast lots of steel for the body, but then use pot metal for a critical stress-bearing junction. Fortunately, there's none of that here. Structurally, it's every bit as durable as a real AR. For that reason, despite the cost, which we'll get to later, I have no concerns about actually playing airsoft with it. It's just not going to break from anything I can do to it. Of course, to play airsoft, the gun has to actually function. So, now for the internals. Let's start with disassembly. First, pop the rear takedown pin and the receiver's split. The charging handle and bolt come back, the bolt drops out, and then the charging handle can be removed from its track. The handguards come off by pulling on the delta ring, as you'd expect. Removing the front pin allows the receivers to come apart entirely. That's it for field stripping the gun, and this is all that's needed for cleaning, but let's disassemble a bit further to examine more closely. In the lower receiver, I can depress the buffer retaining pin to release the buffer and spring, and then wrangle out the short stroke spacer. We'll get to what this is in a bit. I'll put the upper receiver in a receiver vise. I'll first remove the flash hider using my armor's wrench. This isn't strictly necessary on this gun, but other Vipertechs have a threaded adapter holding an O-ring in place that secures the inner barrel. If that were the case, I'd have to remove the adapter. In the upper, the gas tube is secured in the front sight with a roll pin. Once it comes out, I can remove the gas tube from the rifle. Now I unscrew the barrel nut. These are torqued down extremely tightly from the factory, so a hammer may be needed the first time, but it's not necessary to reassemble to the same degree of tightness. Once the barrel nut is loose, the barrel assembly comes out the front. I can now pull the inner barrel out of the outer. The barrel extension is clamped to the hop unit via 3 grub screws. These are thread locked from the factory, so I had to apply heat via a heat gun to loosen them the first time. Carefully dump out the hop-up parts. And taking out 2 more grub screws allows the barrel to slide out of the hop unit. Now that the gun is fully apart, once again I'll go front to back to talk about the internals. The gun came with a brass barrel of decent quality, appropriate in length for the outer barrel. It's an AEG cut, but with a relatively deep hop window. It's meant to be used for the proprietary hop-up bucking, which has a similar design to a PDI-W hold. Typically, I strongly dislike when companies use proprietary hop buckings, but this system is not difficult to convert to use VSR spec barrels and buckings. Vipertech also sells the buckings for cheap, and most importantly, the stock performance is surprisingly good. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so one last thing to note here is that the buckings are glued onto the barrel from the factory for optimal seal. The hop unit itself holds the barrel firmly with grub screws, as mentioned. It uses a ball bearing to apply tension to the bucking, adjusted via a standard wheel. Because of the ball bearing providing tension, it can be sensitive to adjust, but it has fine increments and stays firmly in place once adjusted. The hop-up slots into the barrel extension, which includes the feed ramp. This was a bit sharp when I first got it and was initially shaving down bio-BBs, but a few light passes with some fine sandpaper, followed by breaking it in with actual use, eliminated that issue entirely. With non-bios, it's not a problem to begin with. I'll note at this point that the whole gun was very tight and very stiff when I got it, with takedown pins not coming out easily and the bolt travel having a gritty feel. Through use, the gun is smoothed out considerably and wear patterns are emerging on the bolt's finish. The bolt carrier is steel with an aluminum nozzle, collectively weighing in at exactly 300 grams. For comparison, GHK and VFC both come in at 230 to 250 grams, so this is about 25% more mass. By removing a single E-clip and tapping out the nozzle guide, I can remove the nozzle. At the rear, it uses two O-rings similar to modern GHKs for a better seal. Unlike GHK, however, the front O-ring is nearly the same size as the rear one, so both contribute to sealing the nozzle inside the bolt. These are standard nitrile rubber O-rings, so are easy to replace if needed. 12 by 16mm for the rear one, and 11 by 15mm for the front one. I went ahead and replaced the front one with the same size as the rear one, and this appears to have slightly improved the seal to no detriment. Vipertech actually makes two sizes of nozzle. This is the 16mm, which is the standard, but there's also 18mm, which produces a sharper recoil impulse at the cost of some efficiency. However, Vipertech states that the 18mm shouldn't be used with CO2, as the thinner walls means there's risk of the higher pressure damaging it. At this point, I want to mention that Vipertech makes nozzles to order, so I was able to specify the exact muzzle velocity I wanted with my preferred BB weight. This avoids having to buy additional nozzles or fuss around with grub screws to get the right muzzle velocity, but with VFC now coming with NPAS as standard, it's a little disappointing that muzzle velocity cannot be regulated on the fly. On the side of the bolt carrier, there's a cutout for the short stroke bolt catch position. More on this, along with some minor changes to the bolt catch later. The fire control group is all steel. Lately, more brands have started delivering replicas with steel fire control groups as standard, which is great, but not all steel is equal. In this case, it's some flavor of high carbon alloy that's been hardened and oil quenched, and it holds up to wear beautifully. Where moving surfaces contact one another, the parts have smoothed out from use without deforming. I've actually gone and polished the hammer myself, as even after a few thousand rounds, it still wasn't as smooth as I'd like. The trigger may be surprising to airsofters because it feels like, you guessed it, a real AR trigger. There's a slight take-up, then a solid wall before it breaks at a little over 7 pounds with the stock hammer spring. This is actually a bit heavier than a real mil-spec trigger, but not by a lot. Because of the short wall and consistent break, it's very easy to start applying pressure to the trigger while waiting for a target to expose itself, and then press just a tiny bit more and it breaks. It's honestly a wonderful change of pace from spongy airsoft triggers that break at an indeterminate point, and despite the weight, it's pretty easy to rapid fire as needed. That's enough on the trigger for now, so let's look at the buffer. The one that comes with the gun is serviceable enough, but standard AR buffers are drop-in, so I use a real 3-ounce buffer. I'll talk about why replacing this is a good idea later. And lastly, the spring. This is significantly stronger than a GHK, VFC, or Western Arms, but not as strong as a real spring. Now, you might be tempted to put a real steel spring in, but that's not recommended. Despite the use of steel parts, because this is an airsoft gun, there's no rotating bolt, no hardened locking lugs to absorb the impact, and in the long run the gun will beat itself to death. The stock spring is plenty strong, so no need to touch it. While I'm here, note that full stock Vipertechs also use the carbine buffer and spring with a spacer, unlike full stock real ARs, which use a different buffer design and slightly longer spring. Before getting into shooting performance, let's talk a bit about magazines. Vipertech makes their own PMags and 20-round Stanags, but EBTech and GNP magazines also work with no modification. Vipertech's retro rifles come with an EBTech Stanag by default. EBTech mags work well, but this is the heavy steel magazine rather than their lightweight aluminum mag, and the aluminum mag is pretty expensive at $85 a piece. So I instead chose to use GHK mags, but they require fitment to work properly. GHK mags are slightly wider than other brands or real mags, so while GHK PMags will break in with use or can be filed down to fit cleanly, GHK Stanags will not break in and cannot be filed. To loosen up the fit, I filed the interior of the magazine weld, add a bit more clearance, which is why the inside of my mag weld looks like a gunsmith's nightmares. In retrospect, it may not have been necessary to remove quite as much material here, as the key was actually to compress the middle of the GHK mag shells to square them up a bit better, and then polish the wear points to slick them up. But what's done is done. Once the mags fit, there's some modification needed to the bolt catch. GHK mags have weak springs, so it's necessary to remove the detent from the bolt catch so there's less force for the bolt catch to overcome, and then insert a spacer to prevent the bolt catch from lifting too high. Additionally, I made some minor tweaks to the bolt catch. Small cut on the inside surface to help prevent the bolt catch from rising too high and contacting the nozzle, and a slant on the forward surface to prevent the forward edge of the half-stroke catch position from kicking the bolt catch down at the end of rearward travel. That probably all sounds complicated, but it wasn't much work to implement, and now GHK mags lock open reliably. The last issue with GHK magazines is just that the gas router sits a little high, so I had to use a 3D printed jig to slice it just a little lower. And to be clear, if I used EBTech, Vipertech, or GMP mags, I wouldn't have to do any of this, they just work. So now that I have functional magazines, I can actually do some shooting. The first thing I notice is that the recoil is quite nice. This has a fair bit more kick than my AUG or a TMAR, and the cycle is snappier than GHK or VFC despite the heavier bulk carrier group. The recoil and cyclic rate are in part thanks to the aforementioned short stroke spacer, a plastic puck that sits behind the recoil spring. This puck reduces the stroke of the bolt from 3 inches to about 2.5. This means the bolt hits its rearward position at higher speed, and sooner, returning to battery more quickly. To compare, here's the gun with the spacer, and here's a gun without it. There's less recoil and the rate of fire is significantly more sluggish. Either way, it still locks open on empty, and the gas efficiency is identical. At first I thought I'd prefer the extra realism of full stroke, but it's only actually visible when the bolt locks open, and the short stroke just feels so much nicer to shoot, so that's what I use. I tested efficiency in 68 Fahrenheit ambient temperature and using GHK magazines. For the first test I dry fired continuously on semi-auto until the gun stopped consistently locking open, which occurred at about 90 shots. At this point the magazine was very cold, and if given time to warm up would start locking open again and continue to shoot. For the second test I allowed the magazine to rest for 3 minutes between each string of 40 shots. It failed to lock open on the 168th shot, and then went click on the 170th. For the third full auto test, the gun managed to get through all 40 BBs without issue and locked open, but then sputtered out at 60 shots during the next string. So all in all, gas efficiency is quite good. As long as the mag doesn't get too cold through continuous use, the gun will continue to lock open right until it runs out of gas entirely. This has all been on propane so far. With Devil Hunter modded GHK magazines filled with CO2, the gun can be run on full stroke with an appropriate rate of fire, and it is very loud and kicks nicely. As well, it'll function even below freezing, and does around 150 rounds before it stops locking open. But after using the gun on CO2 for a couple of games, I'm back to propane. The gun just runs so well on propane and short stroke that I don't feel like I need the extra power of CO2 in warm weather, plus propane inflicts less wear and tear and is generally less of a hassle. Still, CO2 is there as an option. As an aside, I've heard that EBTech CO2 magazines have a lower gas throughput, and so behave more like propane magazines in terms of recoil and wear and tear, while still having the temperature and cooldown resistance of CO2, but I cannot currently verify those claims. Originally, the gun did 1 joule with .32 gram BBs, which is exactly what I asked for from Vipertech, but after a parts swap I'll talk about later, it now does around 0.85 joules. I could get it up to 1 joule without too much trouble, but this gives me a bit of insurance when playing at 1 joule max CQB fields in warmer weather. Now to test hop-up. This may sound weird, but this is actually my favorite part of the entire gun. The bucking, as mentioned before, is similar to a PDIW hold, and it does a great job with consistently chambering the BB and centering as it fires. Now, I probably should have done the shooting test before tearing the gun apart, as now the hop needs to bed back in and my sights are off, but here's a 10-shot test group at 20 yards. Despite the 4.5 inch vertical spread, the pattern shows a very tight horizontal spread of just 1.5 inches, and based on how the gun has performed in-game, I expect that vertical spread to shrink down through use. For a comparison, here's the same test performed with various barrel setups in my GHK AUG. Over the years, I've become used to having to swap the bucking on every new gun I get to get the kind of performance I expect, but this is the first one I've actually left as is. Maintenance is a part of every gas blowback rifle, so let's talk about what the gun needs after shooting it for a day. After field stripping the rifle, I wipe out the receiver and wipe off the bolt and charging handle. This is especially important during break-in as the anodization on the receiver and parkerizing on the bolt wear in. Next, I pull out the nozzle and inspect the O-rings. These may degrade over time, so if I see any nicks or other visible damage, I'll remove the nozzle and replace the relevant O-ring. Particularly if I'm experiencing inconsistent rate of fire on full auto, or the nozzle occasionally getting stuck forward, that's indicative of the rear O-ring distorting under pressure and getting pinched. If this happens, the O-ring should be replaced. I've also had good results with using a harder Viton O-ring instead of the standard nitrile for the rear O-ring, as it pinches less and wears more slowly, but it then absolutely needs the front O-ring to be nitrile and the same size in order to seal well. In any case, a little bit of grease or silicone oil to lubricate the O-rings will help the nozzle cycle smoothly, but no further disassembly is required. On the bolt itself, I apply a bit of PTFE grease to visible contact points and buff it off with a finger. This leaves the parts feeling nearly dry, but provides a durable surface of lubricant that won't gum up the interior of the action. Lastly, I check to see if there's any contamination in the faux locking lugs. For the first 1,000 rounds I had shavings from bio-BBs building up in there, but after the feed ramp smoothed out from use, that issue went away. If there is anything in there, a bore brush or a set of dental picks is perfect for cleaning it out. If I've noticed poor accuracy, I can also swab out the barrel, but that's not necessary after every game. That's really all there is to it, so frankly it isn't too much more work than an AG. Alright, this review has been very positive so far, so let's level set with the actual problems I've encountered in increasing order of severity. So first, I had a minor issue with the buffer retaining pin. As is sometimes the case with real ARs and very common with airsoft ones, the buffer was just able to contact the pin during cycling when normally the bolt is supposed to be far enough back to prevent that. Now there exist offset pins designed specifically to deal with this, but the clearances were close enough that I was able to just very lightly file the backside of the pin and the problem was solved. Second, a misfeed with a different nozzle caused the fake locking lugs on the nozzle to strike a BB and the nozzle broke at this thin point. This is purely cosmetic damage, but it goes to show that just because a gun is made of good materials does not mean it is indestructible. It is still necessary to perform regular maintenance and ensure the mags are in good functional condition. Third, after about 5,000 rounds, the gas firing pin stopped resetting. It turns out one of the spring legs snapped. I was able to bend the other leg to go another 2,000 rounds since then, but in the course of filming this review it finally gave up. Fortunately, Vipertech is replacing this part for free, and they are sending a spare as well. In the meantime, I was able to improvise the world's ugliest torsion spring from some spare music wire to finish the review. And fourth, the only brass part in the entire gun besides the barrel, is a piece in the nozzle that controls the muzzle velocity, and in my nozzle this piece broke at about 2,000 rounds. When it breaks, the gun becomes incapable of firing a BB until the nozzle is opened, which takes some work because it's sealed up tight from the factory, and the part replaced. Vipertech sent me a replacement for free, and that got the nozzle working again. This does appear to be a recurring issue among others who bought the rifles in 2021, but Vipertech say they have changed the design in response, so hopefully this won't be an issue in the future. And lastly, I'm not the only one to experience issues this year. Other new owners report seemingly random quality control deficiencies, with guns either not working quite right out of the box or having fit and finish problems. This is certainly not true of a majority of guns, and in each case Vipertech has been willing to provide free replacements as needed, but these issues are unfortunate to deal with given the cost of the guns and the corresponding expectation of quality. Before wrapping up, I want to talk about upgrades and aftermarket. The first thing you may notice when looking at Vipertechs on the internet is that there's very little aftermarket support, but this isn't actually as much of a problem as it may seem. With the OEM parts being about as good as Airsoft gets, there's not a lot of room for upgrades, so most alternative parts are side grades. So first off, one option is to install a weaker hammer spring. Most real AR-15 springs will fit, but Vipertech makes their own soft hammer spring. This slightly reduces the felt recoil, but improves the efficiency in colder climates, extending the temperature range at which the gun can operate. It also reduces the trigger pull to about 4 pounds, on par with a lightened hammer spring for a real AR. Similarly, buffer springs intended for the Western Arms system will work in the Vipertech, and since they're weaker than stock, this helps the gun to work in colder climates. While weaker hammer springs can be used year-round, a weak buffer spring will reduce rate of fire and increase wear and tear when used in warmer weather, so this is a seasonal modification. With the lighter hammer spring and a G&P buffer spring, the gun will function correctly and successfully clear mags without issue, even at just above freezing. Use of propylene, commonly sold as MAP gas, will also improve performance in cold weather, and can be used in gas magazines without modification. Additionally, the buffer itself can be replaced with any real steel carbine buffer, and replacing it with a standard 3-ounce buffer is recommended. This is about the same weight as the Vipertech buffer, but real steel buffers use shifting weights, which both increases the sensation of recoil, and also prevents bolt bounce, improving consistency in full auto. This is the only upgrade that's highly recommended out of the box. And on the nozzle, as mentioned before, the front O-ring can be replaced with a 12x16mm nitrile O-ring to match the rear one. While the stock seal is fine, this double O-ring setup ensures a seal at a range of temperatures and propellant gases. The hop-up can also use VSR-type buckings and barrels, primarily by cutting off the indexing tab on the side of the bucking. That's about it for internals, but when it comes to externals, the real steel compatibility opens up a lot of options. Reel selectors may require some modification to fit, but muzzle devices, rails, stocks, grips, they all drop in without modification. And as mentioned before, reel upper receivers can be modified to fit, although it does require enough modification that they are no longer functional as reel uppers. The catch is that reel uppers hold the bolt carrier group about half a millimeter lower than the Vipertech ones, making magazines sit too high. This is easily fixed by filing down the magazine catch, but because that's a modification at the lower, it's best to standardize on all Vipertech or all reel uppers for consistency. Reel uppers are substantially cheaper than Vipertech ones, so putting in a bit of effort makes expanding a little more affordable. And that finally brings us to the elephant in the room, which is price. Vipertechs currently start at $800 to $900 USD for a gun with no furniture. They only ship via FedEx for about $200, so a complete gun plus fees plus shipping is going to run around $1,100 to $1,200 USD, and then you still need magazines. Is it worth it? Well, that depends on what you want from an airsoft gun. For airsofters who just want a skirmish piece and don't plan to upgrade much, the Tokyo Marui MWS is a great system out of the box with good cold weather performance and a lot of aftermarket support, or you could consider VFC's newer guns for more realistic internals and great real steel compatibility without the design weaknesses or current QC issues of GHK. It's when you start pricing out upgrades that Vipertech pricing starts to seem reasonable. Take a Marui or VFC, add forged receivers, a steel barrel, maybe a high-quality rail system, and before you know it, you're at the price of a Vipertech, and that's before you even get into internals. In terms of long-term operating costs, some Vipertechs have apparently reached as high as 750,000 rounds before needing any replacement parts besides O-rings and E-clips. Now, in my time with the 733, I've experienced some failures as covered earlier, but they've all been limited to noticeably fragile parts. Time will tell, but judging by the overall lack of wear and tear across the roughly 7,000 rounds this gun has seen so far, I believe that the core mechanism will hold up. In fact, I was so impressed with the 733 that I went and bought an M16A4 to convert into a Colt light machine gun, which is where my M16 for comparison comes from. This particular gun has only had about 15,000 rounds through it so far, but aside from sporadic misfeeds with bio-BBs during the initial break-in process, it has had no problems whatsoever. So far, it has proven an excellent base for a gas blowback machine gun. The biggest negative point to Vipertech, though, is the inconvenient magazines. Having to modify GHK mags to work and the gun to work with them is a headache, and other brands are more expensive or harder to come by. If I were to do it again knowing what I know now, I'd probably bite the bullet and purchase EBTech lightweight gas or CO2 Stanags instead. For a more modern gun, Vipertech's PMags are also good to go. Then there's that lingering QC issue. Credit where it's due, Vipertech has seemed proactive about replacing parts for users who do run into issues, which is more than I can say about most airsoft companies, but still, it's not something you want to have to deal with at all. As for actually getting the gun, there are a couple of options. KIC Airsoft carries a few Vipertech guns, but their selection is limited and prices are high. Vipertech does have a web store through which the guns can be ordered directly, however they don't seem to list all their inventory on the site. You can also contact them through Facebook to place an order, although with the language barrier they can be slow to respond. Alternatively, there's an individual in the community who can facilitate this process for a modest fee. If you're interested, ask on the Heavy Recoil Club Discord server. Overall, despite the minor issues, I believe Vipertech represents good value for a specific subset of airsofters. Pure collectors may not see much external improvement over the old Inokatsus, and pure players can get a comparable performance out of a Marui at a much lower price, but for players who want a gun that looks and feels like the real thing while also performing well in the field and standing up to use, Vipertech fills that niche very well. That said, the high price of directly compatible magazines is on top of an already expensive gun, and making other brands work well requires some troubleshooting, so there's certainly room for improvement there, and once again, the quality control issues in 2021 are a real concern. But with those caveats aside, it's a solid product that is appropriately priced for its quality. Well, that's all for today. If something goes seriously wrong with either gun or we have major updates, we'll make a follow-up, and I expect there will be some more content on the Colt LMG configuration in the near future. In the meantime, thanks for watching.
Oh, he's hit.